guys, it's Joel. Welcome to the Taproot Therapy Collective podcast, and this is going to be a little bit deeper of a dive. I got a couple questions after the last essays that we did. Some of this will be a little bit of a retread because some of the questions, said, hey, what's the real deal here? Is it more comprehensive than that? And so I'm going to be more comprehensive, which means I got to go over some of the same stuff again. But this is a history of the DSM, and I think that it's one of the bigger questions that I don't hear talked about much in psychotherapy. If something's coming up in therapy a lot or coming up with colleagues a lot, but I don't see people writing about it and talking about it, especially when therapists all agree on something and they're not talking about it. Those are the articles that I try and write. And in that vein, this is what this article is. So, love it or hate it, there's this thing called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And it's published by the APA, and it functions as this definitive classification system for the mental health conditions in the United States. So every diagnosis that we give, every insurance claim we file, every treatment plan that we have to justify with a SOAP note, that you have to have a treatment plan to write, it all flows through this DSM categorical architecture. And that's part of the system. It's not something that you can really opt out of. So, it is for all practical purposes this Bible of American psychiatry. And yet the fact that we have to diagnose under its criteria is one of the most controversial issues that I've encountered in the field, which is weird because, everybody has to do it. Yet a lot of people off the record will tell you that they don't really like it or don't really care, which itself, should indicate a problem when the clinical rules are different than the clinical judgment on a level like that. And I'm not picking a huge side. I'm not saying that we should throw out all diagnostic criteria or that, if you diagnose anybody, you're pathologizing them, or some of the arguments that people think that I should make. Not that they're right or wrong. I'm undecided and always trying to acquire new perspectives and new information. But to understand, I definitely have critiques of the DSM, and one of those is that it doesn't really have any sort of unifying singular vision, which means that it becomes a very hard lens to use because it doesn't know how it wants to conceptualize anything. And that happens for a lot of different reasons. So one of the things that, I want to make an argument about is I want to refute is I'm not arguing against science. I'm not arguing against evidence-based practice. I'm pointing out places where the science that we assume is scientific might not be very scientific, which is not an argument for pseudoscience. It's an argument for introspection and reflection. So, and we should do that, we should have those conversations. So the DSM-1, it starts with this kind of dynamic paradigm where, everybody's talking in the post-World War II era on basically the language of Freud and Jung still. There's neuroses and there's reactions, and there's these dynamic processes that we don't necessarily use to conceptualize things with diagnosis anymore, but it's trying to describe those in a statistical manual. And so it's talking about sort of balancing forces, the language of psychoanalysis, more or less. And so that nomenclature explicitly used the term reaction for many conditions, like a schizophrenic reaction. So it was more in communication with the environment doing something to a person than a person just kind of doing something in a vacuum, which is one of my criticisms of what the DSM looks like now. A depressive reaction. They're assuming that this is reacting to something either internal or external. So it's a part of a system. Which is, probably a better way to do it. And so it reflected this belief that the symptoms were manifestations of this patient's struggle to adapt. Again, that's a conceptualization that I like. That's why I'm not saying that we should do psychoanalysis again or classical Jungian analysis. That's something that I write about because I use elements of it, but it's not something that I do. So, that's not what I'm making a case for. I'm saying that there are useful things of that model that we have lost. Like a neurosis was not this separate, species of existence, but it was an exaggeration of a normal defense mechanism. And so that's why some of that language is now inevitably coming back as trauma becomes this focus. If you look at the history of mental health, initially kind of like in the 60s, all of this focus was on schizophrenia. Like that was the most interesting thing ever, and it sucked up all the money. And then autism became incredibly trendy. I guess ADHD in the 90s, and then all of a sudden, in the 2000s, it was autism, and that sucked up, all the money. And then the next big thing was trauma. And now, trauma and PTSD and what those are and how we should think about them is the huge conversation. And that diagnostic criteria in the DSM-1 and 2, they weren't lists of symptoms, but they were narrative paragraphs. They were short descriptions of a prototype that the clinician was expected to match against a patient's presentation in the room. So the psychiatrist's judgment was what made it. Do you feel like these forces are present? And this relied on interpretive skill and theoretical orientation. No one's going to ever be 100% competent. But most people who have gone through this process probably understand how to talk to somebody and figure out what is going on. That's another thing that the modern DSM doesn't really like. It doesn't want you to use that subjective judgment. And a lot of my point with this piece and a lot of other pieces is that subjective judgment is completely inevitable. And because it is completely inevitable, when you say, oh, here's a purely objective or logical system, what you've done is hidden the subjectivity from yourself, and then you don't know what it is. And that's a problem because it was somewhere. And I think that's what's happened now in the DSM-5. So like Freudian psychoanalysis, it might interpret like a patient's silence as resistance, rooted in an anal retentive personality structure. Or while a psychiatrist with a more biological or social orientation who's medicating, now they may just see that differently, with good reason. I mean, not all silence is resistance. There's a lot of things that could cause that. And now that the field has matured scientifically in the technique, I think that the underlying conceptualization of the manual is not helping us use those techniques as well. So, while this approach offered this rich, humanistic and individualized view of suffering, it also failed this fundamental test of science, which is reliability. And that refers to just consistency of measurement. If two patients see the same psychiatrist, if two psychiatrists see the same patient, they should have the same diagnosis. But a lot of people were just wrong. And, doctors are kind of loath to criticize each other publicly. A lot of that's reliability. And a lot of it's for, being at the top level of hierarchy. They don't want to be seen, fighting too loudly. And so they don't like to disagree. And because they don't like to disagree, they didn't like to say, well, you're the wrong one and you're the incompetent one, or, whatever. And so the most famous of this was this US-UK diagnostic project, and it compared these diagnostic practices in New York and London. And they found that American psychiatrists diagnosed schizophrenia much more than the British ones. And the British psychiatrists were likely to diagnose manic depressive illness, bipolar, which is bipolar disorder now, for the same clinical presentation. If the symptoms in the case study look relatively the same, they would have a different diagnosis. So it demonstrated that schizophrenia in the DSM-2, it wasn't like a stable biological entity, but it was sort of culturally and theoretically dependent. And I would argue that is because psychosis is a whole lot about culture and technology and the metaphors we draw from those. I've argued that. And if you look up the ritual and animism piece, that's a deeper dive on that. There's a podcast and there's a blog on it. Looking at how psychosis changes based on culture, and it changes over time because you're dealing with deep metaphors of the brain, which a lot of times are mystical and religious and highly symbolic. And symbols are not universal, and symbols are not completely biological. So, of course, psychosis is going to change. So this collapse of reliability was not just this academic embarrassment. It was an existential threat to psychiatry. So without reliable diagnostic systems, epidemiology of just studying and that's the reason the DSM exists, is they want to study diseases, but mental health is messy. It's not cancer or the flu. It's, I don't know, some anxiety, some depression. So how do you group these things together? Big problem. I'm not saying that I have a perfect answer here. I'm just sort of critiquing and offering my perspective. But the researchers couldn't count how many people had a disorder if they couldn't agree on what the disorder was. So there's already sort of this feud there where people always feel like somebody else is doing it wrong. So you enter R.D. Laing, who's a Scottish psychiatrist, really interesting guy, very understudied. I've never heard another colleague talk about him, and I think he's a fascinating person. But he, not just in the things I mentioned here, you should look up some of his schizophrenia stuff, but, he writes The Divided Self, and he argues that what looks like madness was often a sane, intelligible strategy for surviving unlivable situations in the past that's still happening. So you had a more trauma-informed, a lot of these guys did, pretty early in the 60s, they had a more modern trauma-informed thing where it wasn't a moral deficiency or a lot of the things that people posited, or bad genes, they weren't eugenicists. And so Laing posited that the schizophrenic person was not a broken machine, but they were an existential voyager, and they were entering the deep mind. And he suggested that bizarre speech and behavior of the psychotic patient were coded mechanisms about double binds that were put on society or put on the individual. And there is some truth to that, because when a person is given a false choice as a child, it's called a double bind, or by a society, where it's like, work hard and be successful. But if you're not successful, you're not working hard enough because the system's never wrong and I can never get ahead. I'm kind of being gaslit to a point where I feel like the problem when I'm really not. Same thing with a parent that's like, always speak your mind and I want to know who you are and why you're being silent. And then you tell them and then they're like, well, I don't like, that's the wrong thing. That's not who you are. You get all of these things emerging in psychoanalysis where they say, okay, there's a dream of an object in a patient's mouth. And I'm doing the dream analysis and they say the object is glass, and but they're choking, they can't breathe. But if they swallow it, then they swallow this glass bottle, and they're keeping it inside. It's too much. And if they get it out of their mouth, they have to break it, and then it wounds them. And this is really about the double bind that they were placed on in childhood, because if they were said who they were, their real self, if it came out, then they were wounded, like the glass is wounding them. But if they swallowed it and kept it inside, then it was too much and they weren't living authentically. And because their parents and mommy, put them in this position, that's why now they have schizophrenia, because this trauma led to this split. Well, now we know that schizophrenia is pretty genetically determined. Trauma can set it off. It certainly doesn't help. So can certain drugs, we think. Maybe they just raise the age of onset, or lower the age of onset too earlier, but you would have gotten schizophrenia anyway, maybe a little bit of both. These early guys didn't think of schizophrenia that way. They thought it was completely determined by the environment. Now we act like it's completely determined by the genes. We need to meet in the middle here. There's a part of my critique of my profession is that it's always overreactions to a problem that go too far in the wrong direction every time, and they kind of zigzag everywhere if you look at the history of psychotherapy. So, that perspective was terrifying to mainstream psychiatry at the time, which was, largely pretty like racist and eugenicist and obsessed with morality. So your genes had failed, or your, fortitude, you were, not as strong as somebody else. They saw it as the patient's fault somehow. The patient was wrong. And so the patient's delusions, are actually a poetic truth. That's kind of the Jungian take. And psychiatry's attempt to cure them with drugs or shock therapy, it was not medical benevolence. It was this political violence where you're trying to repress somebody. And then Thomas Szasz, in 1960, Szasz says, Lang is kind of coming from the left. He's a socialist and into existentialism and, Lacan and Frankfurt School stuff probably. Based on his writing. I don't know that he's ever said that. I don't think he cites Lacan anywhere that I've read. I haven't read all of Lang though, so I don't know. Anyway, so, Szasz is more right wing. He's like a libertarian, like get off my lawn. I want to grow marijuana and have a bunch of guns and I can do whatever I want on my land. That's kind of, his orientation. So it's more of a right wing argument saying the same thing. And he says, illness is a structural, functional deviation of the body, and the mind is not a physical organ. It's just a concept, so it can't have a pathology. There can be no illness of the mind. There's only problems in how you live, and if you change how you live, you can do better. You maybe need to take medication. You maybe need to think differently. You may, that it's always about something that you should be able to gain control over. Which is, kind of a bootstraps right-wing thing, but it's also sort of making the same argument as a lefty like Lang. Szasz is contending that psychiatry was the pseudoscience and it was used by the state to police social deviance. He, is sort of, maybe looking at the persecution against outgroups, which is not typically associated with the right wing, at least now, but, labeling behaviors such as illnesses or society that is, avoiding these difficult ethical work of dealing with conflict, that they're just sort of taking people away so they don't have to actually figure out how to integrate them into society and do something with them and make room for like the real diversity of humanity. And so this mental illness label allowed the state to just incarcerate innocent people. And so Szasz is a right-wing guy. He's more about you're taking away, my freedom of autonomy. He's not as much into it for the collectivism and relational energy of Lang. But they mostly make the same argument. So Rosenhan he provides this empirical conviction. And I looked up more information about Rosenhan since the last one, because y'all asked. But in the 73 study, he publishes in Science under the name On Being Sane in Insane Places. Or the title, not the name. He wasn't pseudo eponymous, or however you say that. So anyway, it was this sort of sociological experiment, one that you probably could never do today. So he says he's getting 8 pseudo patients, just people to pretend to be patients, and they're sane because they're students. And they have no history of mental illness at all, and it includes a psychology graduate student, a pediatrician, a psychiatrist, a painter, a housewife, and their instructions are super precise. We want you to present to the psychiatric hospital admissions office and complain of hearing voices. And the voices are unfamiliar. It's not someone you know. They're of the same gender as you. And they only say 3 words: empty, hollow, and thud. That's all you say. That they say. And beyond that single fabrication, that's just one lie, they're able to be completely truthful about everything else. Are you hearing the voices now? What do you do? There's no other impairment. They just say, one time I heard empty, hollow, thud. And this was calculated, because he's knowing that the psychiatrists don't really listen or don't really follow a lot of the things that it says that they're supposed to be investigating, which still happens. They kind of slap a diagnosis on you, and what he's trying to do is make the medical system more thorough and say, oh, okay, well, shoot, we're just kind of slapping people around and discharging them, slapping them in and slapping them out, but we need to actually sit with people and treat them. And the current, sort of profit-driven system, the way it's evolving, is not working. So we need to spend more time. Like, he's trying to get it to do something good, but when you make somebody who has a problem insecure, a lot of times they don't do something good. They just do something to deflect, which is what happens. And so 12 students are selected, 12 students of psychology, and they go in, and all 12 are admitted when they say this. And they're honest about everything else. The only lie is, I heard hollow, dull thud be said by a voice. And there was this sort of stickiness to the label. Once they were flagged as insane or having schizophrenia, I'm not calling people with schizophrenia as insane. It was, his language in his document is that, like, once these pseudo patients are admitted, they cease having any symptoms, and they spoke normally. They behaved cooperatively. They told the staff they felt fine. Yet the whole staff, blinded by this label, reinterpreted their normal behavior as pathological, which was the point, is that he was trying to say that when you make this subjective and people have biases, then they just go ahead and use those biases subjectively, which the role of science is supposed to remove bias from procedure in psychology. So when pseudo patients took notes on their experiences, nurses recorded this in the chart. The patient engages in this writing behavior. And they interpreted it like it was this compulsive symptom of psychosis, but it was really just a dude who was bored. And so he's writing down in his journal because he's going to be in a mental institution for the next week. And then boredom-induced walking, because they're bored, was seen as a nervous agitation, that they were neurotic. And the average daily contact with the doctor was about 6 to 8 minutes. The point is for them to get their medical records when they get out, so that they can see what everyone was saying about them that, would probably be colored by just these kind of whims that psychiatry was using at the time. And keep in mind, this is a hospital. There was probably pretty good psychology happening in clinics, but he was trying to say that hospitals should act more like a therapy clinic. Or an individual therapist's office, which of course a hospital is not going to do, even when you prove something like this. Because it would be expensive. These patients were not ever declared sane or misdiagnosed. The hospital admitted nothing after they could get no more symptoms of schizophrenia, which if you have a psychotic break, even if you're in the prodromal period, you're going to see behavior over the amount of time that these people were admitted, anywhere from 19 to 52 days. So they were providing evidence that they did not have schizophrenia to anybody who was using even the pretty loose, non-checklist based system at the time. There's no way for somebody who has a mental illness like that to go in for 52 days and not have another single symptom without any medication. So the label didn't work. But they never said, oh, oops, we made a mistake. They just said, oh, it's in remission now. Well, how did it get there? That doesn't make sense, even what they knew about the diagnosis at the time. So Rosenhan's conclusion was pretty bleak. He said, these salient characteristics that lead to diagnosis reside in the patient's environments and not in the patients themselves. He had proven this, when he brought the clinical gaze of the intuitive, expert into the hospital where the sickest people were being treated, that all the patient illness was like largely this myth. If they had done something different, they probably could have treated these people better. They didn't have to be there. Not all of them needed the treatment they were getting. So, these forces are all sort of converging on psychiatry at this time. There's civil rights activists who say involuntary commitment is a violation of liberty. And a lot of times, especially in the South, it was, black people were just sort of targeted, or Hispanic people at that time. There weren't as many Hispanic people in the South as there were African Americans, but, gay rights activists say, you said that homosexuality is a mental disorder, and it's not hurting any two consenting adults. The public starts seeing things like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and things that are, sort of based on what's happening, and they just start seeing mental institutions as these are authoritarian drug pushers and enforcers like Nurse Ratched. And then you have, scientific researchers. Studies start showing that inter-rater reliability is terrible. It's not working. Insurance companies are not wanting to pay for vague reactions, or the person who wants to sit in psychotherapy for, 30 years just to have a friend. And pharmaceutical industry needed this They needed like a consistent group of patient populations for randomized controlled trials, because if you gave a schizophrenia drug to everybody who kind of said like, I got so manic or depressed that I had like a little bit of a schizophrenia-like symptom and then they didn't get better, then that doesn't really mean that your drug doesn't work because you gave it to somebody who doesn't have schizophrenia, but we can't define or triage schizophrenia at all clearly. So like, what even is it? And how do we know how to study if we don't have a population to give drugs to, which is a good problem. I mean, that's one of the reasons you need diagnostic criteria. They're not wrong. I'll say something nice about the pharmaceutical industry. You do need a group of people that you're studying in order to do a study. So the profession is viewed as soft, subjective, and politically compromised, and the stage is sort of set for this revolution. So when the DSM-3 task force is assembled, Robert Spitzer is put in charge, and this is in 1980. It's sort of during a conservative push for. Saying conservative doesn't really mean a ton because our political parties changed so much in this country, but relatively quickly, not just recently. It's definitely speeding up because of the internet and stuff, but conservatism during this time was saying we want accountability. We don't just want money given away. We want to know that it works. The bootstraps ideology, but it was about like bureaucracy should come in here and it should prove that you're actually the best worker, and we want a meritocracy, and we don't want to give money to all the schools. We want to see which school's doing it right and give them the money, and then the other schools will get it together, which again is not a bad thing. It's just that when you start to add bureaucracy to test for things that are not necessarily testable, you can't find it because it's not testable. I remember like during the Bush administration, they needed to prove that after this like restructuring of the New Orleans school systems, the test scores had gotten better, but the test scores hadn't gotten better when you privatized everything and fired all of the career teachers and brought in all these Teach for America grads and privatized all of it. And so they just gave a different test, and they were like, well, the score on this test is higher than the other one, but that's not scientific because it's two different tests and it was designed to get the result they wanted. What's another example of that? There's, I had it, now I'm blanking on it. This is the kind of thing that I probably should cut if I had more time and an editor, so you have that sort of conservative energy happening. I know what it is. Adam Curtis, in one of his movies, he's talking about when Thatcher and Reagan come in, and Thatcher's like hospitals that aren't seeing a bunch of people that aren't being successful, that are just letting these people malinger and whine and drink water on the government dime. We want you to prove you're not doing that, so we're going to judge you based on the number of beds. So another thing that happens is they just change the assessment metric. So a lot of these hospitals that needed funding and didn't want to be scrutinized and didn't have time to, you can either make an argument that you're doing a good job, or you can just do a good job. Like if you go to most workplaces and you listen to the person who's always by the water cooler talking about how great they are and what of a great job they do, usually the person that's advertising that all the time isn't working and they're one of the worst people there. Same thing with these systems. Like if somebody's doing a good job and you ask them to like track everything and do heuristics and get data and then really prove it, they can either do what they're hired to do, or they can try and be defensive and babysit themselves with numbers. And so what happened in Britain is that they just reclassified like chairs in the hospital to beds and then said, yeah, everybody had a bed. This is how many patients we saw. Real thing. Lots of things like that when you try and introduce accountability into these systems. So Robert Spitzer, he's this, the main guy for the DSM-3. He's a Columbia professor, and he's described usually as like a brilliant guy, but kind of different, and he had undergone like psychoanalytic training, but he never really fit the mold of this like empathetic interpretive analyst. Spitzer was more uncomfortable with ambiguity. He never really liked the kind of subjectivity of therapy. And so in the 1970s, he was obsessed with categorization and data, and had been sort of put into administrative roles because he wasn't really very good in therapy. He wasn't like warm or relational. And so he that rejection maybe made him, or inability to do therapy made him want to make it, a different thing. If you want to psychoanalyze Spitzer, there's probably a little bit of that there. But he's very bright. If you ever read anything that he writes, he's smart, but that, again, that doesn't always help you do something good. So the problem in the field was that it was very fractured. Psychoanalysts believed depression was caused by anger turned inward. Biological psychiatrists believed it was a chemical imbalance. Behaviorists wanted it to be learned helplessness, that, treat everybody like a lab rat. Behaviorism is exploding in the late 70s, 1975 to 1985. That's where American behaviorism people see it as this thing of like, you don't have to deal with cognition or emotion at all. You can just train people because we just sort of input machines. And so Spitzer's reaction is propose a manual that, ignored the cause entirely. Similar to Beck with CBT, like quit talking about how this stuff got here, talk about what to do, because they were angry that psychoanalysts were navel gazing and wasting time, which, valid. So it would solely focus on description. It wouldn't matter why the patient was depressed. It only mattered that they had depressed mood, insomnia, weight loss, and fatigue for 2 weeks. You look at symptoms. And this was this diplomatic, master stroke, because it allowed Freudians and biological psychiatrists to use the same codes. But it was also this philosophical retreat from ever trying to figure out like what these things were or how we thought the mind worked. We just didn't have to know. We just put symptoms together and drew lines around symptoms and called that a diagnosis. But it was just sort of a thing we were making up. So we abandoned the why. There's no reaction to something anymore. Reaction to what and when was the reaction? There's no dynamic force. It's just check these boxes. If these three things, then you have that, which paves the way for psychopharm when Prozac comes out as this sort of, mainstream third gen thing to sweep the world. And so the innovation of the DSM-3 is checklists, and it was, supposed to be this diagnostic criteria where all the psychiatrists will agree now, because if the patient checks this box for one doctor, they'll check that box for the other doctor, they'll have the same diagnosis. Now we're speaking the same language, right? And again, like when I look at people like Beck or Spitzer, who I think did a bad thing to the profession, or at least took it in too far of, the other direction, I don't really have any problem with them personally, because the problems they're addressing were real. And I also think that those people are kind of this inevitability. It's kind of like Columbus gets all this credit for discovering North America, but like, if you let Columbus ships sink, there's enough ships bumping around in the Caribbean. There's so much exploration and interest in that region that it would have been discovered, the next year. He just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Somebody was going to do this stuff. It happens to be Spitzer and Beck that do, a kind of objectification and surface level. Let's get to the practicality by scraping the depths out of the thing. Somebody was going to do that. It happens to be them, but I don't really have an axe to grind against them, because I just think that they would have been replaced by the next guy that would have done that. But Rosenhan, his experiment destroys psychiatry's reliability, and the checklist fixes that. And so this shift to this bureaucratic methodology now feels more scientific, which when I see people who think that they're purely logical, what I see is a fear of interior space and an insecurity, but maybe that's just me. Maybe you don't. And so it's just taking responsibility away from the clinician. I didn't diagnose you. The manual did. This is just what you have. So it's objective. And now you have this disorder. I don't just think that. You don't have to fight with me about it or explain yourself. Just the objective things about you give you the objective thing here. And it doesn't really matter why you did it. If this is going on, you've got it. And so the checklist system is popular. And sees this like reification of psychiatric disorders where a diagnosis of like major depression becomes treated as a thing that the person has instead of a description of what the person is experiencing or a description of a process within the person. So now the diagnoses get tacked onto you. It's not just a way of thinking about how you think, that's the change that's important here. We're not thinking about thinking anymore. We're putting people into boxes. They don't always fit into. And so this bureaucratic, like I have people some of the time that are just like, I have to have a diagnosis, I have to know. And I'm like, look, you got a little bit of this, you got a little bit of that, but I got to either check 3 boxes for this one or 5 boxes for that one. And you don't meet criteria for any of them. But this is why I think it got there. This is what I think that you're doing. This is what I think you're compensating for. This is how I would treat that. And you came here to get better, right? So this is how you could be treated. But you're landing in this vague or more general diagnosis just because you kind of have elements of this dopamine disorder or ASD or ADHD, but you don't totally meet criteria if you want a diagnosis based on the book. If you want to, I'll refer you to psych testing. And I've had 2 or 3 that go and they pay a lot of money and they do these all-day psychiatric tests, and I flip to the end of those reports when I get them, and they say, this person doesn't meet criteria for any of these things, but they show, symptoms of these, but just not enough to meet diagnosis. And it's like, okay, yep. And that was an expensive way to get back there. If you want to just wait, 2 or 3 more years, the diagnosis will be different anyway. And then when it's different, you can just go ahead and get the newest one. So there's this feeling that happens at this point, which we still have, that if we have this scientific answer that explains why we are the way we are, all of a sudden we won't feel the way we feel. And I think that's a problem too, because that isn't true. The diagnosis doesn't help you. It guides the treatment that helps you. And a lot of people view diagnosis as treatment. Like a lot of people will go get diagnosed with autism now and then be like, this explains so much, I have autism, and then leave and never pursue treatment or changing anything. It's like, well, why did you need this random guy to tell you that you had this thing that they made up, basically? We could make up lots of different ways to do this. This is the one we have right now. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't do that. I'm just saying that that's something that a lot of people do. And it seems strange to me because the whole point of diagnosis is to guide treatment to change the way you feel. And if you're just getting the diagnosis to sort of justify the way you feel, why do we need psychology at all at that point? It's just like a card catalog or something in a library. It's a Dewey Decimal System for people. It's not like a tool to affect the way that we live and feel and relate, which is what I think it is. But, some patients don't, because they want a diagnosis and then they want it in one session and then they want to leave. So the Spitzer even says later, the pharmaceutical companies were too delighted with the DSM-3 and the checklist created this perfect target for drug development. He regrets that. And then he sort of sees, things like the panic disorder and things he sort of thought should be treated just drugged. And then the hospital leaves the walls of the hospital at the DSM-3 because you don't have to go to the hospital anymore. All of a sudden the hospital can come to you. And one of the issues that I have and a lot of people have with people that are over-medicated is that you're taking a behavior that you really could change if you wanted to, and then you're adding in a drug that takes a chunk of your personality and these other things so that you don't have to change it. And I think you should treat trauma and get to, as high of a functional state as you can, and then medicate the things that are sort of endogenous to the way your brain works and are not going to go away. And that you should definitely weigh the pros and cons of medication. That is a little bit more measured of an approach than we've had for the last 20 years. But, I'm not the king of the world. So who cares what I think? But that implicit in that DSM-3 is this revolution where we don't define the phenotype, the symptom, reliably. Then the genotype, the gene in the biological mechanism, it would never be found. So it's seen as like if we put all these symptoms in categories, then we'll find the cause, and it won't be what the psychoanalysts think. It'll be some brilliant new science thing. So this is just this pragmatic placeholder that we're doing until neuroscience can explain to me why everybody's depressed. And this assumption was never fully articulated, but there's this pervading idea that psychiatry would soon have its own germ theory of the specific cause of the thing. Just as medicine discovered pathogens or specific diseases, psychiatry would discovers specific brain lesions or neurotransmitter imbalances or genetic markers or something that they can point to that is explaining behavior that makes it a little bit more biological than just symptoms together. But that never happened, and they were expecting it to happen. Like in the DSM-4, I think a lot of people who were initially conceiving of it, why it didn't change anything people thought would change and it didn't go in a direction people liked, was that when they announced publication, the initial idea was like, we're going to put, we're going to like, the Human Genome Project by that point will be really far along, so we'll have all that data and that'll probably give us some information. But then it about like the connection between biology and psychology, but then it didn't. Like the Human Genome Project wasn't super useful for understanding these things, and so then they had to publish something, and the APA certainly makes a lot of money publishing the DSM. So they also have other incentives to do that. And so you get, this, like Alan Francis has this kind of reaction to the DSM-3. And he says that it's diagnostic inflation, that the checklists are so easy to use and they're so divorced from any context that the boundaries of mental illness are expanding too rapidly in normal human suffering, grief or shyness or boisterousness, or the individual psychology of the person, that somebody who is a hypochondriac or that somebody who views themselves as a victim who needs help and they can't learn to feel better on their own, they need to figure out what's wrong with them through some external source, they're going to be more likely to collect all these diagnoses, which still is true. Francis is right. And so he says the DSM-4 is this conservative reaction, and his goal was to like hold the line against this proliferation of new disorders and say we don't need, all of this new stuff that's just going to, every time anyone feels bad, now they have a diagnosis, which is an argument, people still make. And so when you move to the DSM-5, there's this new idea of like spectrums, like people have been talking about autism spectrum, and they wanted to have this paradigm shift. But the problem is like the committees that make these things are enormous, and there's subcommittees. I mean, it's like a Congress within a Congress and a Senate, and there's psychiatrists and clinical psychologists and social workers, and the social workers get up and the social workers say like, well, this is the person in the environment theory and you're being too pathologizing. And of course, nobody listens to them. One of the DSM-5 people, the lady who did the new grief diagnosis, she was a PhD social work teacher who found all this sort of cultural and sociological information and then turned it into a diagnosis that they did accept. So I'm not trying to downplay the role of social workers. I just mean that if the biomedical model has to choose between the lived experience of a social worker and the profit motive in healthcare, who do you think they're going to pick? The people, short version of that is that not everybody on these things agrees. So a lot of times there's like the main people, the chair and the board, like have this sort of grand vision for what it's going to be, just like they did with, the DSM-3 may be the only one that like from beginning to end was telling the same story, or it finished the story that it set out to tell. The 4 and the 5 didn't do that, which is a lot of my issue with them. They started to get all these spectrum diagnoses and things into committee, and then and we don't know a ton about exactly. People talk. There's some people that said some stuff, but like there's NDAs that stop anybody from doing whatever, because you don't want there to be this political backlash where somebody comes out and they're like, so and so doesn't want trans people to have blah blah blah, or so and so doesn't want whatever, and then all of a sudden you're involving the public with external pressure on this thing that's supposed to be whatever. So I don't think the NDAs are terribly nefarious in their intention. They may be a little bit nefarious in their effect, but a lot of these things we don't know. Like if somebody's saying something outside of the room and then they're on the committee, then they probably said the same thing in the committee, so you can kind of know what people say, but this is not a public process. Very little of it is public. And even to the people in it, there's these sub-hearings that review evidence, and then the bigger board listens to everybody, and then they make a decision, and then ultimately it's up to this kind of small group in the chair to sort through the entire process and publish another book. So this isn't just like one guy sitting down and all of psychiatry votes for it. Spitzer's the chair. Like these are huge processes. And by the time we got to the DSM-5, it was ginormous, like one of the most complicated, projects. And I wonder if those people get paid. Email me if you know that. Like if I want to be like a DSM-6 writer, which I don't, but like if I flew up there and sat there for like 4 months, do you make a lot of money doing that? How much do they pay these guys? Or are they just doing it for like the street cred? I would like to know that, and I don't. Anyway, so these aspirations was that you put everything on a spectrum, so you're not going all the way back to processes, but you are saying like, hey, it's not just a checklist. It's kind of like, this is whatever. And the critics hate that. And they're like, autism spectrum disorder, what is this? Like, you're putting a spectrum between a person who can't talk or function at all the way down to somebody who had like a shut-in male with an overprotective mom. And you're saying like, that's the same thing? They're like, they don't like that. Because that's, it is a huge range, but if you're going to move to a spectrum thing, which is probably a better way to do it, probably not a perfect way, but a better way than what we were doing in the 4, then you need to kind of commit to that and do it. But when they get into committee, they fight, and the vision is not ever really fleshed out or finished. And so you get all this stuff crammed into the end of the book, basically. Like, those treatment revisions used to be tiny, like in the early ones, where they were like, or not treatment revisions, those are the treatment revisions are like where they're like, this is Microsoft Windows 3, but it's not Microsoft Windows 95 yet. This is Microsoft, NT. We're working on XP, but we're not done with it. It's the 4.5 or the, 5.2. It's like the in-between version. That's not what I mean. What I'm trying to talk about is appendixes. The appendixes used to be tiny. They were like, here's some useful information like differential diagnostic trees. And then, hey, here's some stuff we talked about that seems important, but we haven't quite, this is proposed for future consideration. So, if you want to research it or if you want to think about it and publish something, like, weigh in on that for the next version. They used to be teeny tiny. And now that they can't agree on like how to write the book, and there's these giant, paint by committee things, then the appendixes have just ballooned. And what they do is they take the whole spectrum thing and they say like, hey, we think this is right, but we're not going to make it real yet. So we're just going to stick all of that in the end. So it's not part of the book, but it's still saying like, hey, we think this is real. But the spectrum stuff is completely at odds with the diagnostic checklist, which is still how the book functions. So like, what are you doing? That's another thing that's interesting is like, I think you could have every psychiatrist in the world sit down and try and make a DSM that they like, that's their favorite version, and you would never end up with anything like this. Because, science is done through debate, but not all debate is science. And you look at these books and it's like the core unit of, is a reaction and a process in the DSM-5. But the categorical checklist is this discrete disorder category. And then the nominal spectrum that you can kind of pay attention at the end is this huge umbrella category. But then also, just think about all those things all the time that sort of contradict and are based on like 3 different eras and 4 or 5 different conceptualizations Dagwood sandwiched together that don't really make any sense. So it's like, what am I supposed to do, man? Like, you would never, ever get this book out of one mind. And it basically is like a study in why conflict resolution, it's like a document of conflict resolution instead of a diagnostic and statistical manual. It doesn't make a ton of sense if you read it cover to cover and try and do what it says, because it's not really telling you how to think about this stuff or how, and the whole point of these are to say, this is how the APA thinks and conceives of it. Maybe here's some options and ideas, but like, this is our idea and we don't have one anymore. And we're just publishing that. Weird. So the scientific rationale for that conclusion is pretty robust. There's these longitudinal and cluster analysis data that they look at, and it suggests that there's this distinction, between, for autism especially, because Asperger's was always problematic to them. There's this distinction between autism and Asperger's, but it's kind of artificial because where do you draw the line? You could draw it anywhere. So let's just make it a spectrum where the diagnosis is the line. And so clinicians really feel like that's going to happen. And at different sites, they were applying those labels, and consistently anywhere, if you make it a line, it's a lot easier to put people on it, and not exclude anybody who needs it and not add anybody who doesn't, which is the whole point of a diagnosis, is to keep the ones that don't have something that you can't agree on what it is or where it comes from out, and then keep the people that all do have it, keep them in it. So how that operationalism of the ASD spectrum, it raises all these concerns when they're saying like, but how do we operate based on that assumption? Like, these people say, this is how the neurodevelopmental brain works. We think this is how conscious and cognition works based on the science. And then the people who are saying we have to do something with that information, how do we operate based on that assumption, get mad. And they say, research indicates the specificity of this criteria is better, but the sensitivity, how well it is to pick it up and find it is less. And this means that there's a significant, subset of individuals, particularly those with higher cognitive functioning or those that were previously diagnosed, with other things, they're going to lose access to services under this spectrum role, because the spectrum is making more people included, but it's also making people that are not similar to that line that you're drawing be kicked out. So like if you have a diagnosis, it's just a checklist. You either fit the criteria or you don't. If you have a line, you have to have a whole lot of symptoms that you like. That you have to have a whole lot of symptoms that you are similar to. But if you had some of those symptoms in a diagnosis that aren't really on that line, or the diagnosis goes away, then you have people who have something that isn't diagnosed now that no longer can receive medical care. And that happens with a bunch of these. And I'm not going to go through every change. I mean, that you can look that up. That's not the point. The schizophrenia categories, which never really made a ton of sense to me. I mean, I don't think there's been a catatonic schizophrenia patient in America for 100 years. Those diagnoses go away, and they become more just psychosis disorders. And Alan Francis says that by turning schizophrenia into attenuated psychosis, in a lot of instances, this would lead to this massive medicalization of weird or eccentric people who there's nothing wrong with. They have the right to do that. And the false positive rate for predicting conversion to full psychosis, like this person has schizophrenia, you want to know that person's going to get basically what you want to do with schizophrenia, because it's a long age of onset. There's a prodromal period. And the prodromal period is where you're doing stuff that's kind of odd, but you're still connected to reality. So you wander around and all of a sudden you have this delusion but you're like, hey, that's kind of weird. I don't know why I think that, but I know it's true. But you're relatively well functioning. You have a little bit more of those. Then you lose total touch with reality, have a psychotic split. If it's not treated, you have maybe the possibility of brain damage or doing behaviorally a thing that messes you up. So the whole point of the disorder is how do we catch these people who are in the prodromal phase, who believe some odd stuff or having strange aberrant beliefs pop up that weren't there before? How do we catch that to predict the onset of psychosis? That's what you want in a schizophrenia diagnosis that works. But they can't do that because if you say, hey, everybody who's acting like they have the prodromal phase of schizophrenia and believes some weird eccentric stuff, go ahead and flag them with a psychosis disorder. Now you're picking up people who may never have a full psychotic split. And so there's kind of this fight. I would say my answer to that, if you care, is that psychosis is something that you can be more at risk for, kind of like cancer. You can have the genes for cancer, or you can smoke the cigarettes to get cancer, or you can have the diet that does or doesn't give you cancer. But all of those risk factors add up to the thing being more likely. And so there's some people, a lot of people, that are going to get schizophrenia anyway. It doesn't matter what they do. It's just, as far back as we can go, grandma did something weird, dad had bipolar disorder, this person had dopamine disorder. Dopamine disorders run in families a lot. I've got so much of the genes for the thing that when I hit 18, I'm going to have this thing happen in college. Other people maybe have it where they're going to have a sort of psychotic break, but they take LSD and they do marijuana, and that makes the outcome way worse. The break is worse than it would have been. Other people may never have gotten it, except the environment doesn't protect them. They have a little bit of the genes, and those things compound. But the DSM wasn't doing it in a probability or a cumulative way. It was trying to move to a spectrum. And what I'm describing makes sense, but that isn't a spectrum, right? I like the spectrum more than the checklist, but the spectrum still can't do this thing that I'm describing, which is, how do you catch people and add up basically likelihoods and risk factors and then say all of these things contributed to this happening as a causative thing? They're like, well, that's too much information. We may not have all of it. We don't know how much drugs they use or will use, and we don't know their genetic history. And, how do you screen for that? And I don't really know, other than sit with a patient for a couple hours and talk to them and get all that information, which is what I do. And then say, oh, okay, this is kind of what I think. This is what I think the trauma is, which can be treated. And this is what the dopamine disorder is, which, treating the trauma is going to bring down the symptoms of that some, but I think you're always probably going to need medication for OCD or schizophrenia because you may be on less than if you didn't treat the trauma. I can have that conversation with a patient, whereas a book like this fundamentally can't tell people how to have that conversation with a spectrum conceptualization. I hope that makes sense. So the DSM-4 was this model of personality disorders, which is like 10 distinct categories, like narcissistic, borderline, avoidant. And that is kind of recognized by the time the five's being written as like scientifically bankrupt, because there's like all this comorbidity where you're like, well, the borderline is acting histrionic right now, so I'm going to give her that one, or I'm going to give him that one. But then there's all this overlap. So the same thing that the DSM-3 was supposed to get rid of, you're disagreeing on diagnoses again. So there's this overhaul for personality disorders. There's a bunch of stuff in it where they say basically criterion A, which is like, what's the level of personality functioning on a 0 to 4 rating of impairment? If it's not causing a problem, we're not going to pathologize it. And then criterion B is like pathological personality disorder traits. Do you have any of these traits? And then let's put them in 5 domains of like different types of personality traits we're looking for: negative affectivity, detachment, antagonism, disinhibition, psychoticism. But I don't know that that's a better way to do it. It may just be a more complicated one. I think you're probably going to end up with the same comorbidity things. I mean, one of the other things is like testing and implementation fatigue. Like, you can make these systems incredibly complicated, but the reality is that the more complicated you make them, the less people will do it right. Because an ER doctor is overworked and a therapist is just trying to get to the thing that they want to do. When you tell them that they have to do like reams and reams of other stuff for hours, just less people do it, and then the diagnoses don't mean anything anyway. So there's another, problem with this system. So the big thing that happens is, the NIMH, the federal government's National Institute of Mental Health, with Thomas Insall as director, but it probably would have happened anyway, is like, I'm not going to use the DSM anymore because the DSM has never really been reliable or valid, and we can't succeed if we're using this to study things, because the symptoms that we're clustering together aren't really going to make research any better. It's not going to figure out if drugs work. It's not going to figure out if this type of therapy treats this type of thing, because you're just calling it PTSD, but really PTSD is like 4 things. So which one of the 4 was it? Just looking at a PTSD diagnosis doesn't mean anything. And I agree with that critique. I don't really agree with the NIMH on a ton of stuff, but I don't think that's wrong, because, I mean, he may be right for the wrong reasons there, but like, PTSD where? Like, is it somatic re-experiencing? Is it a mood dysregulation? Is it a relational, projection and attack, like type of antagonism there that's not quite a personality disorder? Because if somebody has an unfair expectation about relationships from trauma, and they're, like trying to control other people with whatever because they don't feel like safe, if whatever, and that comes from a trauma, not like an early attachment thing. It's not a personality disorder. It is PTSD. You're going to treat that type of PTSD completely different from flashback re-experiencing. And you're going to treat both of those types differently than somebody who has, somatic overwhelm and like mood dysregulation and panic type trauma. Like, that's going to be a different kind of therapy. Maybe they have all 3, maybe they have 2 of them, but having done this for a long time, those are different types of memory. The type of your brain that thinks of yourself as the story is a different memory process than the one that like, hears voices introspectively and like remembers these relational things, than the type that is like relational memory. And that's different from the like deep implicit embodied emotions of how your body remembers to feel emotion. There's a lot of neurology that backs up my point, but I'm not going to go on like a defense of that. But like, you see those things different clinically. Neuroscience also indicates that those memory systems are kind of different. So like, my axe to grind is like, why are we just calling all of that PTSD? What type of memory is the trauma in? How did it get there? And what symptoms is it causing? Even the new PTSD diagnoses just don't do that well. Look, we talked in that other episode that I did about like borderline personality disorder. It's strange because it's this like weird fossil of these older systems that they're trying to fit into the new one because it's very useful for certain types of clinicians to conceive of that. But then it doesn't really fit with any of the new assumptions that we're making. So how do we say like the old assumptions were wrong, except they sort of got this one right? How do you do that? You can't. Because borderline originally comes about when they're saying, hey, there's psychotics who are totally not in reality. And then there's neurotics who are in reality, but they're suffering and have these, emotional distresses. And then there's borderlines that are in the middle, the border, that's where the term comes from, the border between neurosis and psychosis, where they're on planet Earth most of the time, but then all of a sudden reality becomes plastic when they feel one emotion, and then but they're not lying, they really believe it. So we can't say that they're lying, but also the things that they believe, there's 6 people there, we all see it, it didn't happen that way, they felt attacked, but nobody really attacked them. Actually, they were the problem, and then they deflected and confabulated a new version later that matched their self-image. So what do we do with these people? Because we can't call them psychotic because they don't have schizophrenia, and we can't call them neurotic because this is more than an anxiety disorder. But then you change to a checklist system, and then you still keep it, and then you go back to spectrum, and it's trying to be conceived of in all these ways. What is the border on a spectrum, right? So you have all of those things happening, and there's a ton of secrecy, again, with the DSM-5. The DSM-5 was like the most secretive and closed of all the processes, which, again, I don't think they did for nefarious reasons. I think they did it to keep the public as not and the news too, largely, because with the DSM-4, one of the things that happened is they had these committee meetings about how they were going to get rid of Asperger's, and it leaked to the news, or it wasn't as secret, so it was available for the news. And then everybody freaked out and started writing all these articles and being like, all these people aren't going to have care, and I can't work because my son gets these federal benefits. If psychiatrists delete them, then I won't get money. They wanted to avoid that for the 5, so that they didn't have to be in conversation with the public, and the public's didn't have the ability to influence the process by heckling or interacting with the people or writing about what they're talking about as they're talking about it. And a lot of the things that they added in the 4 and 5 for children, I think, are entirely made up ways for parents to diagnose something is wrong with this child instead of how does the environment support the child. I don't really like any of the child thing, but I'm not a child psychologist, so I'm not an expert in that. Also, who cares what I think? But when you go through, at the end of this, one of the reasons why I want to cover the history of how it got here is I've seen a ton of hostility to the DSM, but no one's allowed to talk about it because we all have to largely bill insurance and be professional. And so again, I'm not saying this is my opinion. I'm just kind of giving you a lay of the land and how it gets here. But you see hostility to the DSM in my experience, and about half of clinicians hate it or don't care about it. But it's the thing that we're all supposed to be using and do use to some extent. And when I was in training, I was shocked because I went to somebody I won't name, but they were the person that was in charge of me when I got out of school, or they were in a supervisory capacity, and multiple people were yeah, I don't care about the diagnoses because I have this one axe to grind against the DSM. It doesn't make sense anyway, so just put something you can build and then move on. I'm doing this on the behalf of an institution. I'm not talking about Taproot or any individual practice I've ever been on. This was, at the instruction of psychiatrists and stuff. So it's not wasn't my decision. It's what I was told to do. But I was what? We were taught it was the gold standard of evidence and all this stuff. And then you enter the workforce and really high up people are saying I don't care about it. So one of the things that the diagnosis, one of the points I want to make is the DSM has created this paradox where there's diagnosis is treated as both this identity defining thing, but it's also utterly meaningless at the same time. And a lot of people treat diagnosis like it's a horoscope, or worse, this excuse to behave however they want. Oh, I have to do that. I have autism. I have to do that. I'm borderline. It's no, man, if you can give me a 30-minute explanation of all the things that I need to do to enable you as a stranger in a store, then maybe you're not neurodivergent enough to warrant my I'm respectful to everybody. I'm a trauma-informed therapist. I'm talking about where people use basically diagnoses that they have as when people weaponize the language of psychotherapy because of the internet or these Facebook support groups or whatever to get other people to do what they want when they could do for themselves. And I'm not a, bootstraps cut Medicaid person. Hopefully you know that if you're watching the show. I'm talking about abuse when somebody is disguising themselves as the victim with the language of psychology. And because a lot of people do that, it makes diagnosis look worse. And so, some people cling to it, the diagnosis, they define themselves by it. Like I said, some people want a diagnosis but no treatment, which again doesn't make sense to me. And then and they orient their whole self concept around a diagnosis, which is never what it was supposed to be or is. But the public perceives it that way. And then other therapists and patients have been diagnosed with so many things. They've been to the ER 20 times in 3 states, and they've gotten 20 diagnoses in the last 15 years. And they're just like, it's all BS. It doesn't matter because nobody even knows what it is. They tell me I have a different thing every time I switch psychiatrists, which is true. Like, if you want to make an argument that this thing is scientific at all, everything they did 2-3 was to make it more valid, and psychiatrists still don't agree on any of this stuff. So if they don't agree and everyone's getting different diagnoses from different psychiatrists, then you either have to say one of 2 things is true. 1, the book doesn't really work. Or 2, American medicine is the book does work, and American medicine is incompetent at applying it. So the system doesn't work. But you can't continue to pretend that these things work, because how can that be true? That this thing is completely valid and reliable and consistent, and then half of my patients that have switched psychiatrists a couple times and been to the ER a couple times have 9 different diagnoses with no overlap that are wildly different. Like, I'm not talking about like bipolar versus schizophrenia or schizoaffective versus bipolar. I'm talking about way all over the book. How does that happen, right? But if you know the answer to that question, email me. But like, there also seems to be this pervasive belief among patients that a diagnosis is this permanent thing that all clinicians have access to because we've made it so important, and that if you get it, it'll follow you for your whole life. I've had so many people that are like, I don't want to go to therapy because I don't want you to diagnose me with this, because if you get diagnosed with borderline or if you get diagnosed with this, then you'll have it for the rest of your life. And I'm like, no, if you have schizophrenia, you'll have it for the rest of your life. If I diagnose you with schizophrenia and you don't have it, you're not going to get it. But other doctors will think that, not unless you tell them or you give me a release of information to send your records to that guy. There's not like one club we all hang out at. There's not like one giant medical record that we all log into and look at. Like, it's your medical record. Unless a court tells me that gives me a HIPAA waiver and says that I have to give it to a judge or you sign an ROI, it's not going anywhere. But there's this perception that it's the most important thing because the profit motive is treating it that way. So patients assign this mysticism to it, that it must be important, when I think it's probably one of the least important things. You know, if we didn't have a DSM, I still think I could get where I was going with patients. I wouldn't be sitting there being like, well, I don't know what they have, so how could I possibly treat them? The only scientific way to deal with anxiety is not to tell somebody to relax or relate to them or see where it comes from or how often it happens, or like, you know, what part of their body does it live in, or what does it do to their posture if I tell them to experience it in the room and then share my observation. I don't want to do any of that. If I don't have a diagnosis of the type of anxiety they have, and then I can't go be told based on that diagnosis what's evidence-based, how could I ever treat anxiety? I mean, nothing can be self-evident. I think it's the least important part, because if you burned the book, I could still probably do psychotherapy on you. And not because the book ever existed, you know. Like, I use the DSM. But I'm just saying I don't think that is the most important part of your treatment with me. So to combat this inflation of diagnosis that the checklists cause, Alan Francis and the DSM-4 task force, they introduced this clinical significance criteria. So they say to receive a diagnosis, the symptoms must cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. And their intent was to create this gatekeeping mechanism where it's like, look, don't read about this thing on WebMD or Facebook, or hear that your friend got diagnosed and then decide like, oh my gosh, I once was nervous, I'm a neurotic, and then go to try and get a diagnosis. Like during COVID, like one of the things that would come up in the consultation groups, like nationally, if I asked people, it was like, all these people were like basically getting depressed and anxious, sometimes because they were, you know, shut in during COVID. Some people like that, but I think sometimes because they had to spend time with their family all day. And because of the anxiety, they decided they had ADHD, and they all got on like Ritalin while they were like at home. And that like happened nationally during COVID. Like a lot of therapists talked about it with me. And, it's like, I don't know. So I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. But so Alan Francis with the DSM, 4, when he's saying that the gatekeeping mechanism is trying to stop people from doing that. Like, don't just be in a situation that makes you nervous and then decide, do you have an anxiety disorder? But the problem with it is when you tie suffering to behavior, when people are higher functioning or they're more resilient, or they're a little bit brighter or a little bit more emotionally intelligent and they're coping better, you exclude people who are suffering but they're not acting on it because they're mature or they're, more capable from treatment. I mean, some of the sickest people that I've ever seen, like with a dissociative disorder or something, it was so compartmentalized where they were so afraid of being the abuser, they made sure that suffering never hurt anybody. They never turned it outward. They never abused anybody. They took care of everybody. But then they went in private and they hurt themselves with alcohol or with dissociation, or with panic attacks, and they built routines so that this didn't interfere with their functioning. But they were still, emotionally in hell. So I think that the point of psychology is to treat suffering, not to say, go behave badly and then we'll fix your behavior so you can go back to work. I have a big issue with that conceptualization of like, you are a cog in the grease and capitalist steam engine, and your only job is to, make that thing work. We don't really care how you feel. That seems like a scary direction for psychology to go. So, who benefits from a diagnostic system that only recognizes suffering when it impairs productivity? Insurance companies benefit because if you're, working, then basically there's a lot of reasons why they don't have to pay for your treatment. Employers benefit because they don't have to accommodate workers that have something that's not affecting their output. And the economy benefits because you have a lot of people who don't take time off work to do things. But I don't know that that's true, because I don't think in the long run the economy benefits from people suffering some of the time. But, who doesn't benefit? The person who's coming in to receive care, the patient. If a human being is suffering and they're told that suffering doesn't count because they can still work, you're gaslighting people who may be some of the most sick people, except they're more compassionate because they don't want to hurt other people or affect other people who depend on them. And so they're internalizing a lot of suffering, but it's still real. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not real. Just because you can't count it doesn't make it's not real. And you have some clinicians who are like, well, if it doesn't show up on the scale, how do you see it? And it's like, just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not real. And there's some people who came in for a session and they're telling me how great they are. And I'm like, man, are you okay? And then they just start crying because they're not. They're coming in to tell me about how great they're doing and how in control they are. But it's not true, and it's the clinician's job to see that it's not true and give them the chance to be honest about it. So what would like a more humane criterion work? Do I have anything to say other than whining about the history and weighing in on like what I think of all the participants in the process of history? I mean, I think a truly patient-centered diagnostic system would not ask, can you work? It would ask, are you suffering? The SUD, the subjective unit of distress, is a lot more important than we've made it. And if the answer is yes, then that should be enough. Suffering's an indication for treatment. I think one of the biggest failures is that we know the brain is like mesh networks and how it works. And because we know it's networked, it's like affecting these kind of regions. And a lot of the problem with the brain, the DSM-5, was that the QEEG research and the MRI research, where they thought that they would have ways to like map these symptoms onto biomarkers or these diagnoses onto biomarkers. When they really got it in, the other people who like don't like that form of empiricism because it's a little bit subjective, like tore it to shreds, we think. And then they weren't able to use all of this data and research that they said that they were going to use when they did it. So if they didn't use it, somebody didn't like it. And if you look at those lists of people, you can probably tell what the sides of these arguments are. But one of the things that I don't understand is that I read a lot of neuroscience and cognitive science because I think it's interesting, and they're doing a lot of the work that psychology used to do, academic psychology used to do, is like they make theories about processes in the brain because based on results that they get in subjective intuitions, but there's not a way to measure a lot of these things. Like QEEG has a lot of limitations. Like fMRI has like wonderful structural resolution, but it takes forever to get. So you're missing this data. With QEEG, you can see within the fraction of a millisecond, but you have these 13 electrodes. They're on the top of the brain. And a lot of people, we're basing this on an assumption that I think is true, that you can make determinations because the brain is networked based on what's happening on the top level of the neurons. You can make determinations about what's happening, at deeper levels inside of the brain. Like one of the, and that when you could, and we know that that is happening because when we stimulate the outside of the brain, the deep brain changes, like on scans. So we know that that's true, but there's this like, we can't see it yet, so we can't believe it's real. Well, you're just not ever really going to be able to see everything in psychology. Like you can't, you have to kind of feel how things work. And, I've said before, like even in quantum physics, that's kind of how a lot of people are discovering things, is intuitively, even though ultimately they got to justify it with math. the discovery happens there. And a lot of these discoveries aren't allowed in this process anymore because of the bureaucratic nature of how they're fused together on these committees. So why can't psychotherapy, have this same conceptual flexibility as the harder sciences that are studying the same organ? Like, why? And I think a lot of times the answer is academic insecurity. Like, I was told I can't talk about anything other than my specialization, and my specialization, bumps up against another one. So I have to retreat back into mine instead of fusing them together. And another one is this insecurity of like, well, I can't be taken seriously unless I'm acting on completely empirical information. Well, guess what? Your need to do that is a subjective bias that most of the time is wrong. So your need to be this logical being is being fueled by an emotional energy. So like, we are always running on emotion, man. Like, you can't take the subjectivity out of science, not this type of science. And at this point, you can look like in a computer of any major medical system, and you can see the frequent flyer with hundreds of diagnoses. So you just have to make the case that the checklist doesn't work. That drawing lines around clusters of symptoms isn't really going to get you anywhere scientific. It's not going to get you It's not going to get you anywhere scientific when you're trying to find out the back end, the why these things are there, and it's not going to get you anywhere scientific when you're trying to figure out the how-to of treating them, clinically. Because as we do this, the outcomes get weirder and worse. But then also, like, it doesn't tell you how to get to, like, a better understanding of what the disorder is, because you're the one that created it. You drew the box around the symptoms, and then you expect this other information to materialize. Well, it's been a long time since 1980, and it hasn't done that yet. So let's rethink the system. And then the document itself has these contradicting assumptions. Like I was saying, it tries to pivot in one direction, but then those pivots get held up by committee that can't agree, so they end up with an incomplete vision, but then this other part is assuming a different thing. Or, the end of the book, like, a lot of that spectrum disorder is basically telling you to ignore the stuff that is canon, the stuff that's in the appendix of, like, yeah, consider this. But what you're telling me to consider is contradicting the thing that you're saying is real in the actual book. And again, this is a diagnostic manual, so it's not like you have to read between the lines in order to see these things. Like, they're not going to tell on themselves and say, like, do two different things that are opposite. But in a lot of ways, the DSM-5 is telling you to do that. It's a Dagwood sandwich of a bunch of theories that don't really go together. And, there's also one of the reasons why this is happening that they won't look at is they want to have psychiatrists on these panels, but they also want to have clinical psychologists. But obviously the psychiatrists have more power, and they also want to have social workers, but obviously the clinical psychologists are taken more seriously and have a little bit more power than the social workers, the LPCs. Hell, the LPCs are probably treated more seriously than the social workers. But, when you read like Yalom, or somebody who's like the gateway drug that brought a ton of people into this profession, Yalom was the gateway drug for a lot of people in my generation. Like, he was doing therapy for an hour before he ever adjusted medication. And he was doing therapy weekly. Psychiatrists don't do that anymore. So maybe one of the things that we should I don't think that's a good system. But like, if we're going to do that because of our economic engine, if we're going to do that because of the structural hierarchies of the hospital, the psychiatrist probably has never been in therapy. They probably have never done therapy. And if they have, it's going to be like CBT or DBT at a student counseling center or something, and I'm talking about the vast majority. I'm not saying that there's no psychiatrist out there that does this. I'm saying all of the incentive structure of our world made sure that this stuff changed drastically from how it used to work. And the incentive structure will control most of what happens. If you're going to do that, then maybe you need a different manual for conceptualizing medication and therapy. Because there's not that much overlap anymore. So if there is, they're two different jobs. I don't think they should be, but if you're going to make them two different jobs, maybe you need two different job manuals. So if you meet a psychiatrist that's doing therapy today, you're likely, to find that they're like 80 or something, because nobody can afford, hospitals don't want to have psychiatry at all. They have to, but what they want to do, like if you see a billboard where a hospital's advertising, it's going to be for delivering babies, or not curing, but treating cancer, because that's where they make money. That's what they can charge all this money for. Psychiatry, they would get rid of if they could, but they got to have it. But nobody really wants to do it. There's people that feel called to do it, that go into it, but it's not like one of the high earning things, because we moved to this service-based system, and they're looking at psychiatry and they're like, where's the service? It's all just like talk, even psychopharm. It's just like you asking them these questions. So like, where's the service? So, there's that whole system is, I guess, the detail that I left out of the last episode. I talked about the STAR-D study. I talked about a lot of the things that are indications that the system doesn't quite work. But this is the history. This is how it ended up in the place that it ended up. So, what do you do? I think you can re-legitimize subjectivity as just a valid way to discover and organize things. A lot of people feel like there must be sort of some common variable that maybe is indirect pathway regulation. That's a pretty good theory, where the sensory gating is bad. And so, information that should be filtered out is not. And so you get this powerful intuition, and that indirect pathway, it's kind of in people that are more mystical and eccentric, maybe more likely to be on the autism spectrum, but also to have a dopamine disorder, that these sort of should go fit together. That'd be one way to do it, is to kind of get clinicians to feel this stuff out and see, what are you treating this stuff with? And if you're treating a lot of things the same way, maybe they're related, you could discover things in subjective ways. But then you also need to replace quantitative dominance with qualitative study. I think the numbers and the meta-analysis is what's leading a lot of these processes into the words, because if they can't find it into the numbers, if they can't find it in those numbers, then they just don't think it's real. And there's just a lot of things that you're never going to see on a meta-analysis that you will see in therapy. If you do it for 3 years, you will see patterns that you will never see on a spreadsheet. I'm sorry, but you will. And currently the wisdom of the field is locked behind these profit paywalls, these private notes and isolated therapists. And we need a Wikipedia of clinical practice. Like, we need an open source, high quality access that isn't super expensive, because people that make what I make are just not going to be able to pay $800-900 a month to subscribe to these giant libraries. Yet we're supposed to follow evidence-based practice. So I'm like borrowing my friend's login and trying to figure out how to, do a library, records request for these papers that I want to read. And there should be a way to share kind of qualitative data easily that's open source, that doesn't give total ownership of it to a company to just profit off of your work, where you could retain ownership, but also share it, retain a patent, opportunity without, things like that would benefit the communication in the field in a way that we don't seem to have anymore. And then fourth, I think that we should teach philosophy and narrative and neuroscience in graduate schools. I think that therapists need more neuroscience than they get, because they're talking about polyvagal theory and these neurological concepts, but a lot of times they're using them wrong. I went out and learned this stuff and took classes on it and got downloaded lectures and everything. And I'm not an expert, but I know enough because I need to know it for my job, but we don't get it in school. And it was just sort of, it's never like they were like, you have to learn philosophy because you're going to be a therapist in like 1940 or something, but they just sort of assumed that people of that station would have absorbed these things that were what we call the liberal arts, the humanities, and the philosophy and some anthropology and sociology. They just assumed that you would like be versed in the liberal arts if you were going to be in a human field. That's not true anymore. So we need to build that into the curriculum, because you do need it to do this work. And then fifth, and most importantly, probably we had to replace that functional criterion with a suffering criterion. Psychology should exist to reduce human suffering, not to optimize human productivity. And so I think that path forward is about choosing between science and narrative. And it's about realizing that science is a narrative, and it's the greatest, most complex, and most rigorous study that we've ever tried to tell. And I don't want to attack science here. I want to tell its story better. I want it to be more scientific. And we often treat mathematics as if it were this bedrock of reality itself. But the numbers are not what's real. So, this is a time where we're going into this unhealthy place where there's all this pseudoscience that is replacing medicine, basically, because medicine in general is alienating so many people. Either they don't have the money to afford it, the insurance to pay for it, or they don't have access to it, or they can't navigate the field because they have bad experiences with it. But lots of reasons we're alienating people who I would like to bring towards science. But what's happening is they're running into pseudoscience because they're getting alienated. And so like a lot of people are like, I don't want to critique this because maybe there's some problems with it, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You're going to drive people towards pseudoscience if you tell them there's problems in healthcare. That's like the missionary argument to me. I mean, some of the more horrific sexual abuse places that you see are these sort of like places that are driven to do like missionary work, because they're in this place and they're like, well, we can't admit that there's a problem because we're the city on the hill here and we came to minister to people and set a good example. And so we got to cover it up and pray it away and find some way to minimize it and repress it because we can't admit there's a problem because we're here to represent the good, whatever. And when you're saying I can't criticize my profession because if I criticize it, I'm discrediting it, you're discrediting it when you don't criticize it and everyone knows you're lying, or everyone thinks that you're dishonest or that you're blind or that you're naive or whatever. You alienate people when you can't have these conversations. And you don't have to pick between the DSM and crystal healing on TikTok. You can point out problems with both of those things. And like before the people who write me and say they worked so hard at their PhD, they care so much, they help so many people. Remember that cult leaders think that too. Okay. Like people put enormous work into these belief structures that are not tied to science. So can you, so can I. And it's our job as humans to interrogate that impulse, not to pretend that it isn't there because we're good people who work hard and believe serious things. Everybody thinks that, dude. Everybody thinks that about themselves. People believe things because they've believed them for a long time, and they defend them because they're traditional and they're old and they have a history. Well, I just told you this history. What do you think about it? I mean, half the time I make an argument like this, people start telling me how this system works, how the committees work, what they look at. I know the process. I know the history. That's why I think that there's a problem with it. Don't explain to me how it works like that makes me go, oh, okay, well, if they have a committee, fine. No, like academia is not an exception to these things any more than a TikTok influencer. And if you don't believe that, go Google like what are the biggest scandals in academia 10 years before now, because you'll find out what everyone did wrong when they no longer are stakeholders in the thing. Right? They're not going to tell on themselves right now. But there's huge problems with academic research in every era, and there are now too. We are not an exception to history. And so like the DSM-5, if you look at look at the hierarchical taxonomy of psychopathology. I mean, that's a better system it has P factors, and they are a general factor of psychopathology. And they represent this overall susceptibility, like I was talking about with schizophrenia, or that's what became the psychotic disorder. And they also look at spectra. So these broad dimensions, the intersection of these things, like where these symptoms come together around certain nodes, but not even putting them on a line like a spectrum and not putting them on a checklist. That's probably a more useful way to study. That's probably a more neuroscientifically and cognitive science, evidence-based psychology. I think we need to bring more neuroscience. We need to bring more cognitive science into psychotherapy in a way that specialization of academia resists. And those are my conclusions. I think, that if we don't offer a therapy that is narrative and deeply relational, we'll continue to lose patients to those who do, even if that person is a pseudoscience influencer that's offering them a lie, because they're still telling them a story. And I'm telling you, I'm reading this book. I don't know what the story is. I don't know what the assumptions are. I don't know what they want me to do with the information. I think they published it because they got a huge committee together and they had a fight and then they published a book. And that's not a very good story.